almost done. I think overlapping figures seems like a good idea when you're drawing it, but when you're inking it, that's when you find out it's a lot more challenging. I'm going to ink some rocks because rocks are easier to ink while I am holding the iPhone. So I'll talk a little bit about how my thought process when doing it. So basically what I try to think of is that light is kind of coming from above, and so as lines come up towards this area, they get thinner and they break up as they get closer to the light. But as they get away from the light, you start to see thicker lines down here, so that it gives the illusion that there's shadow. And that's a thing I think that's important to know, is that the thicker you make the line, the more it feels like you have shadow underneath there. So because there's less spacing, it's all about spacing between lines. Large amount of spacing feels like there's more light. Less spacing is more like shadow. So, okay. Then I think it's good to kind of vary the line weights, because you're dealing with something that's organic, and you want to get the feeling that even though these lines you're putting on there are kind of decorative, and that's the thing when you're doing something like rocks, you're adding kind of texture to them, so that when people are viewing it, hopefully they're saying to themselves, okay, this is an organic object, this is something that was created by nature, it has a randomness to it. It's not like, even when you're doing something that's more of a tech surface, even that, by having different line weights next to each other, you add more life to it, and you get a sense that there's something real happening. And that's, I think, the illusion that you're trying to go for with your comic book drawings, is you want some believability, and you want people to be able to look at it and feel like this is happening whether I'm looking at it or not. It has sort of that authenticity, and I think that helps tell the story. That's ultimately what you want to do with your art. So there's all these little like minor decisions that go into making the art, and that hopefully inform the story, which informs the reader, which creates a better experience. And I often hear other artists who are kind of getting into doing comics, they'll ask me like specific things about whether it be perspective or anatomy and all that, and all that stuff is hugely important. It's like the basis of everything you do, but you also want to make whatever you do convincing, and that's kind of the most important part, is making it convincing to the reader. So if they're looking at what you do and they go, okay, that's a rock, and it doesn't take them out of the story, then I think you've succeeded. So however you approach that, whatever rendering, when I say rendering style, that means the kind of lines you put down on the paper to show off, whether it be lighting or texture on something. That's kind of what I feel the definition of rendering is. But whatever rendering you choose to do, doesn't really matter, as long as the person who's viewing it feels the rock more than sees the rock. And that's pretty zen for this time in the morning, but I think it's the way to think about it. You want to feel the characters and not be taken out of it emotionally, and be thinking to yourself like, oh, this doesn't look real, something's wrong with this. When you start asking yourself that, when the reader starts asking themselves those kind of questions, that's when I feel like you've lost them, and it's once you've kind of taken them out of the world, it's really hard to get them back into it. So as long as you're kind of consistent within the world that you've created and it works within that framework, then it doesn't need to be like everybody else's solution. You can find your own solution. So I'm going to do this for a little bit longer. If you guys have any questions that I can answer for you, go ahead and drop them, ask the question in there. I'll try to speak to it live. If not, I'll read it later and try to give you some answers. But like I said, it's consistency within your style, within your world, that is the most important thing. That's the takeaway. The one other thing I would say is when you're approaching inking or anything like that, doesn't matter whether you're using a brush or using a pen, Croquis or Rapidograph, whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. It just matters that you have control over whatever you're using. And when I say control, that means that you have enough experience using it, or that you understand how the specific tool works, so that you can get it to perform in the way that you want it to perform and to give you the image that you want. So that's really the bigger issue, is being able to control the tool that you're using at the time. So people will say, oh, you know, which pen are you using, or is that a specific brush, or is that, you know, what have you. And those are important questions, because, you know, you want to understand what's out there, you want to know what's available to you and how each thing works. And I totally get that, and I understand that that's like an important thing that sort of informs your knowledge base, like what's available to me and how do I use it. But in the end, you have to put in the work with it and learn how it works, but more importantly, how it works for you, how it works with your style, right? So you want to be able to get some time in with it. There's nothing going to replace that. Like I could tell you, you know, where every single artist out there could tell you what they use and their approach to it, but ultimately you got to empower yourself and get in some time with each of the tools that you think might work for you. And ultimately, you know, when you're messing around with this stuff, when you're learning it, when you're spending time with it, it's all about what you're trying to say with it. If it gives you the line that you want consistently, then there's really no need to experiment. You found it. You found the thing that gives you the look that you want. Now you move on to telling the kind of stories you want to tell, making the kind of illustrations. You know, I mean, all of it ultimately is storytelling. I mean, whether you're doing a standalone illustration or you're doing a piece of comic art, it's all about telling a story. So what I'm saying is, get familiar with your tools and then get down to what I feel is the real job, which is telling a story and getting those ideas out there. So I think a fun thing to do is when you have a series of lines, when you do, it's kind of classic cross-hatching trick, is you've got lines going one way and then you put lines going in a diagonal away from them. It gives a viewer a sense that it's not a complete filled in shadow. It's a gray. There's like light coming in there. And that's ultimately when you're doing what I consider to be comic book art, which is, you know, line art based kind of stuff. I mean, even though the definition of what is comic art today is really different, I mean, there's so many different styles. There's so many different things you can do with the computer. Comic books definitely aren't limited by line and then coloring within those lines, which has been the traditional kind of limited comic book style because of printing for a lot of years. But when you're doing that style, I'd say a huge percentage of what you're trying to do is how the lines, the spacing between the lines is really what you're doing. And you're kind of creating the illusion of light and dark by how many lines you put on the paper, but also how those lines are spaced out. So that to me is kind of the art behind inking, at least the thought process. And here's an example of as a line comes in, it's sort of thinner, and as it goes around, it's going to get thicker. And it's thinner as you see more light hit it, and it goes underneath. It gets thicker as it goes away from light. It's thin, and as it goes around, it gets thicker again. Now these lines are going to be right next to some spotted black areas, as you can see right here. So ultimately, those line weights aren't going to really show up in the final piece. But what I try to do is be consistent all the time with the thought process. So you're always honoring kind of your underlying fundamentals, even when you know those fundamentals aren't going to show up necessarily in the final piece. You still want to make sure that you're always thinking that way, and you always have that mindset going. All right. I'll talk to you guys later.